So I recorded all of this and then found out that my microphone was not on. So I'm going to do a brief overview of what I said, even though it did not happen. So what you're going to be looking at is the different words that you need to be defining. That's what I really think is the most important focus at the very beginning of getting a resolution, is to be able to define it, be able to know what you're actually talking about. Because if you understand what you're actually talking about, then you can start to talk about the values that should come from that, the arguments that come from that. And so we're going to look at wealthy nations' obligation and development assistance. Wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations is the resolution for November and December. So you're going to take it both to the novice tournament and to the tournament in December at Columbia. So however you define wealthy nations will also be how you need to define other nations. So the way that you're defining who the wealthy are is the way that you need to define who the unwealthy are. So for wealthy nations, I would suggest either going with the highest GDP or the highest distribution of wealth. You could go with other things. That's completely up to you, but you need to have a very valid reason. Normally, highest GDP is going to be what people see as wealthy. When you decide what you're going to have as wealthy nations, you should list the top 10 to 15 countries, and then also the bottom 20 countries, because these bottom 20 countries are going to be how you define other nations. I hope that makes sense. So the way that you're defining your wealthy nations is also how you need to be defining your unwealthy nations. And so just get them from the same list. Ensure that you're as equitable and as accurate as possible to defining what those countries are. Something important to also look at with wealthy nations that I want to point out really quickly is that wealthy nations is going to sometimes be defined as just countries that have a very Western mindset. But the truth is that when we go and we look at the top 10 countries, there's the United States, there's China, Japan, Germany, UK, France, India, Italy, Brazil, Canada. Those countries do not all have the same viewpoint on life. They don't have the same cultures. And so it's really important for you to not let yourself be pinned into being forced to talk about a certain culture or a certain ideology when that's really not the case. The next word that you're going to need to define is obligation. Now, I personally would not really suggest worrying too much about this definition. Most people have a pretty clear idea of what obligation means. I would say have a definition or two in your back pocket in case somebody defines it as like obligation is like the ultimate thing to do before you die. I don't know, just something really funky. Three really good sources are Merriam-Webster, Cambridge University Press, and Oxford Dictionaries. So these three, I would suggest just grabbing one or two of them and having those as your source for the statement obligation. Obligation is essentially the idea that if we look at Merriam-Webster, it's number 2. It's kind of the idea you're going with. So it's something like the demands of conscience that obligates one to a course of action. So the demands of your conscience, of wealthy consciences, should obligate them to the course of action of development assistance to other nations. So the biggest thing outside of wealthy nations that you're going to define is development assistance. What is national development assistance? Official development assistance. So this is super important. So if it's a term coined by the Development Assistance Committee of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development to measure aid. So this is going to be huge because what you want to look at is like places like this that define what that looks like, that define how we and others can help.
Okay, ladies, we have like a line of 6 of you that need to go to the bathroom, so you need to be patient, okay? So, Alex, do you want the front to look like this, or like this?
So it looks like there's food aid. Let's see what country program will aid. There's a portion of aid that donors. So here's what I would put. Development assistance is defined as government aid designed to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries. So what does that look like? That's where your contentions are going to come in, right? Is that maybe your argumentation is going to be that the best development assistance that a country can give is via giving information. Or you're going to say, no, the best way is to give them money and we can't afford the money. That's going to be something that you have to define. Excuse you. Sorry. Welcome to working in an elementary school. So, these are going to be the main definitions, right? And then what you need to do is you need to kind of rethink the way that you're doing this. So it's like these countries, these 10 countries that you list, have an obligation to provide government aid to promote the economic development and welfare of these other nations. Also, important to look at economic development is one way that it is defined, but also welfare is another. And I would honestly look up the word welfare. I would define welfare because what you can ensure is that on the AF or NAIG that you can argue one of these, and that's okay. So that's all I have for now. Hope that helps. The very first thing you are always going to do with a case is you are going to look up those definitions. You're going to really seek to find the most useful information that you can. Also, not what I did was I just copied and pasted this. You are also going to need to print out this page because this is where I got that information, and by printing it, I actually have it in context so that if someone asks me for it, I have it. So that's it. Email me if you have questions. Text me if you have questions. Talk to you later.